Welcome to the Streets and People podcast presented by Get Around Cabo Car Free. Get Around Cabo Car Free is a volunteer community movement advocating for more transport options for people who can't drive in Caboolture and Morayfield in Queensland. In today's podcast, we'll be covering one of these three broad topics. It might be Road Rules 360, where we discuss Queensland's road rules, the legislation, the design for people walking, biking, in wheelchairs or on a scooter. It might be Not Everyone Drives, where we chat with people whose transport options don't include a car in a car-dependent society. And it might be People and Projects, where our conversations are with people working on a specific aspect of inclusive transportation. Here we are on People and Projects, part of the Streets and People podcast. I'm still so new at this and we're still trying to get the hang of it. This is the second episode in that series. We are here on Gubbi Gubbi country, which is Caboolture in Queensland. And today I have in our super amazing high-tech studio, also called the spare room. So I do apologise for any ambient noise around the place. And I am here with Mia Zellman. I know you because you contacted me. You're doing your master's thesis on the Wamuran Rail Trail, and I was one of the participants in that project. And we had a lovely chat yesterday, and I said, come and be on my podcast. So that's how that happens. Tell me a little bit about your thesis, how you started, where you began, what made you interested, what was it like growing up here, anything and everything you like.
Well, thanks firstly for having me to chat on the podcast, and it's such a great initiative, and I would not have thought this thing was going to pick off in a place like Caboolture, but it's such a town that deserves it. So thanks again. Now the positions are switched. I was interviewing you yesterday and today you're interviewing me. I'm doing a Masters of Urban Planning at the University of Melbourne, and before I moved to Melbourne I lived in Germany, and before I lived in Germany I lived in Wamuran.
Just for our listener, Wamuran is just near Caboolture. It's sort of on the outskirts of Caboolture, and Caboolture is on the outskirts of Brisbane.
That's right.
And it's famous because it's the Wamuran Rail Trail. So I think that's its most significant landmark.
Yes, I'd say so. The Caboolture to Wamuran Rail Trail follows the old rail corridor that used to lead from Caboolture to Kilcoy, which is from Wamuran about 40 kilometres west. Wamuran's a small sort of rural farming town, 10 kilometres from Caboolture. There's a lot of pineapples, strawberries, mangoes, raspberries, any fruits that the heart desires. There's a big farming community there. However, as urbanisation and development occurs, that area is becoming more land for, I'd say, even hobby farmers. So people buying up acreage and wanting to escape the suburban or urban areas. I grew up there. My parents are both strawberry farmers. I grew up on the strawberry farm. My dad's been in farming from generations of farmers. He's German, so that's where that German heritage comes from. They've been living there for about 20 years, and so I grew up with my brother in Wamuran, went to school there, to primary school. Later went to a private school in Caboolture and later transferred to Rothwell. I spent a lot of time sitting in cars, driving to Caboolture, driving to Morayfield, or being coached by my parents. There were moments in my life where I really craved independence, and I realised children can be independent when they're given correct infrastructure. That was shown to me when I went to Germany to live with my grandmother to improve my German. That was when I was about 13, turning 14. It was amazing. I was riding to school, I was riding to catch up with my friends, I was taking the train to Frankfurt, I was walking around. It was safe, it was healthy. I just remember coming back at 15 and I just felt so sad and depressed that I would have to sit in a car to get anywhere, to get to all my friends. I did end up taking buses, and I'd always catch the train to Brisbane, and I did enjoy the time on public transport because it just gave me, to be honest, a bit of privacy as well from living in the family home where you don't get that sense of privacy. I could listen to my music, I could read books, and I wasn't dependent on having to sit in a car and concentrate while getting from A to B. I didn't have to be worried about being on my phone, or I could let my mind wander sitting in a train or a bus. That craving for independence pushed me to move to Germany after I graduated high school. I spent nearly 7 years living in Germany, so my undergraduate degree was in sociology and human geography.
What's human geography? I've never heard of that.
It's basically the area of geography that focuses more on the human aspect of it, so a mix of sociology, anthropology, looking at how humans have affected the environment and how the environment has affected humans and interplay, the soft science of geography. So rather than geology, let's say, you've got human geography.
That's good. I mean, it helps me understand, because where we live impacts who we are, and who we are impacts where we live. So it's not this, I'm separate from the land and the land is static. If I'm in a beautiful green place, I feel great. If I'm in a concrete jungle, well, that changes. If I'm on Morayfield Road, which is a road that I have many times complained about on the podcast with my co-host John on our Road Rules 360 series. You did that for 7 years, and then you came back and you went and you did your master's in Melbourne.
Yes, that's right. So my time in Germany was extended due to COVID, etc., and I ended up coming back at the start of 2022 and moved straight to Melbourne. Melbourne was an active decision because, my parents still live here. I wanted to be closer to them. I just could not imagine living somewhere where I have to buy a car. I couldn't afford it at the time, or even if I could have afforded it, I didn't even want to spend the money on a car. Melbourne at that time seemed like the only option to be able to have that lifestyle. I cycle around there. There were a lot of rentals at that time because they'd just opened the borders, and I found a place that was 3 minutes by foot to the train station that would take me into the city. The cycle route to uni is about 15 minutes with several options depending on if I want to be close to cars or not. Yeah, it was close to shops. All the amenities were there. I did not need a car. So obviously I don't know if you can be an urban planner and also want to drive because just what the effects are on the environment and personal health as well.
Would you say that your studies in Frankfurt made you give up the car? Would you say that it was the last nail in the coffin?
I'd say it kind of shifts. I think when I was really learning about it and studying it, because I had a car when I was in the village. I was living with my grandmother just on the outskirts of Frankfurt, and there you could get by with a bicycle, but it was kind of similar to here that your friends were separated and you just needed a car. When I moved to Frankfurt, it was an obvious choice. And I think giving away the car and using a bicycle and walking, the ideas were solidified through personal experience. Look at what can happen to your body if you're walking or cycling.
Yeah.
And I'd always notice that when I did visit Germany back and forth, that I'd always gain a little bit of weight when I was in Australia. And I'd always feel a bit, I don't know if I felt tired, but I did notice it in my body.
It's so clear then, isn't it? Charles Marone from Strong Towns, he says he was in Italy walking everywhere. He was eating chips, so like hot chips, but he walked everywhere and he still lost all the weight. And then he moved back to Minnesota, which is where he lives. And he just put on the pounds, and that's the difference. I've just been doing a whole public health analysis, just the cost of collisions, $30 billion a year. Just that is the human social cost, they call it. That's a report. And I found out that building roads is $30 billion. And then there are 10 times more health burdens and people killed from respiratory cancer, heart, all the rest, from the car, from the emissions, from the obesity. Yep. But it also is developmental delay, cognitive decline, actually low cognitive ability in children, kind of everything. And I've got some problems with my feet at the moment. I think if I was walking everywhere, I would never have had that problem because my body would always have more muscular strength. It feels that I have to go to the gym in order to get exercise.
Well, I always found it ridiculous. Even in Germany, when, as I said, living in the region, when I did start going to the gym, I'd drive there. I'm driving somewhere to sit on a bicycle. It just saves so much time as well when you calculate riding to work or riding to uni and back. It's 30 minutes a day, and maybe I don't need to go for that jog this afternoon because I just did a pretty strenuous bike ride. It's incidental exercise. Yeah. So I think coming back to this planning degree, I think that's where it just opened my eyes. During the sociology degree, I didn't really know where it was going, and I did some internships in the city planning department in Frankfurt and in mobility research, and that's where I thought it applies to my lifestyle. It is fascinating from a sociological and philosophical perspective, but it's also going to get me a job at the end where I can hopefully change people's lives. So that's where I am now.
And you're doing a thesis on the Wamuran Rail Trail. I moved here 2 years ago. You actually told me much more about the WAM. The vernacular name locally is just the WAM.
People should be able to explore the regions. That's what they're starting to do. And I think that with this rail trail, as ecotourism grows and people are more interested in health, things like rail trails will hopefully become more popular. And in a place like Wamuran and Caboolture, where it's not a really far distance. It can also support other uses. And that's essentially what this thesis is going to be focusing on. Maybe I'll just give a bit of background of the rail trail. It opened December 2020.
Only 4 years ago.
Yeah, it's not that old, but it was in planning for a really, really long time.
Okay.
So it was in planning for about 10 years. And I questioned that. I was thinking, why would something like this take so long to plan and get so long to be implemented? Because the land is essentially laid out. It's already been drained. It's already been prepared for transport corridor. My question in this thesis are, what are the barriers to cycling implementation in regional and rural and peri-urban areas? That's where this thesis will be going. I don't have the answers yet. A lot of it seems to be around political interest and political will. Funding might be an issue. Leasing of the land is also an issue, or the fragmented land ownership, because oftentimes these historic rail corridors, the owners that have lived onto the back of them have incrementally grown into them, and that's just kind of become their land. And so taking that back is quite difficult in these regional communities. You don't want to cause any problems with landowners. So it's really trying to get that political interest there and also the community interest there and the community, because it's not as if this rail corridor between Wamuran and Caboolture wasn't being used before. People were riding up and down it long before it was a sealed path. They were going up there with their mountain bikes. Kids were using it closer to Caboolture to get to school. And now it's an example of build it and they'll come, because it's so much more accessible to use for people with mobility scooters. There's a small community situated at about the 5 kilometre mark on the rail trail called Rangeview. It's a small residential suburb. People there have 5 kilometres access on either side. They can go to Wamuran, get their hair cut, have a coffee, go back, or they can go to Caboolture.
There is a community, you go down a hill and
Yes.
there are some stairs. So I just reported that for lack of accessibility.
Where it's sort of like a dirt track
Yeah,
up.
that's it.
I've noticed that several times as well. And there is a main entrance to the estate, but you can make it a lot more permeable by creating better exits and entries. And there's lots of obvious things that can be improved, even along where the schools are, where kids are just walking on the grass and there's a crossing 100 metres ahead, but it's not intuitive planning. So the thesis is kind of focusing on how can we improve the rail trail, but can this also work as a catalyst to improving the surrounding infrastructure and the missing links, let's say, from when you finish at the rail trail to getting to Caboolture station to take the train to Brisbane or wherever, or up north. This is what I want to focus on. Also, how can urban planners be advocates for community needs, and rather than sitting up in their ivory tower just making decisions and creating master plans that are planned to be implemented in 20 years that will change once that councillor, or once the planner is gone, or the councillors have changed and the aims have changed. It's really about getting things done quickly and incremental planning as well. It is important to have big long-term goals, but people want to see things get done, I think.
There's a lot of room for getting some community feedback for really tiny little projects, tiny little budgets, stuff you can get from the council tip. You can recycle those things.
Yes.
I would love to be able to do things. I don't have the sense that I can implement that. So maybe I can do some adaptive urbanism, but I also am a community organisation and I don't want to get the council offside either. And I also know that with Transport for New South Wales, we've got this new thing where the councils don't have to get permission from Transport for New South Wales about council roads. That's just being sorted out. Chuck Maroon, in his Strong Towns book, he calls it subsidiarity. He says people at the bottom, the first rung, need to make the decision relevant for them. And you start to have a bit more cross-pollination and you get more done at the lower levels. It's cheaper for councils, it's cheaper for the state. Yes, it won't be perfect, but hey, it's not perfect as it is. It's just a very different way.
I would love for planning to emphasize more is the importance of community engagement and community organisation, because I'm going to come out of this degree and I don't know if I'm going to be much smarter, to be honest. I think I've got a lot more questions coming out of it than I had going in. The thing I've learnt is the planner has to balance all these different interests and become a sort of mediator between the community and the council and the developers and the landowners and the residents. So there's all these different interest groups we're trying to balance, and And I think everyone needs to question who are we designing roads and cities for.
And the thing is, who should be designing a road? Should
Yes.
an engineer be designing a road, or should they be designing how to do the minutiae? I always
yes.
think there should be a clinical sociologist.
Yes.
But you go into the street and then you go, all right, well, what would be really good to get this street working? And that would be the role of a clinical sociologist, and I've just made up that job title.
The power of observation could go a long way.
Exactly. And then you get those people to design a street
Yes.
that makes the people who live there, who are in that space, work it. And then you get the engineers. And I think they have that in the Netherlands. They brought that in the mid-90s in the Netherlands. Of course, in the 70s, they had this whole kindermoord,
Yes.
the child murder thing that came about because all these children were being killed on the streets
Yes.
in the Netherlands.
And they wanted to give those streets back to the children who were using them for play and not for a functional node or a transport node. It was streets can be spaces and places. They're still just as important as a park or a lake. It's still a part of the urban environment. It's just who does space belong to and what purpose does space have. And it just seems ridiculous to me, or wild, that we're not even asking or engaging with the people that once it's designed or developed, they're the one, the engineers come in and they do all their modelling, but then they leave again, and the people that are really confronted with the issues, the way it's been designed or brought up, are the people that are living around it. Even with this rail trail, one of my interview questions with the councillors and planners and landscape architects was, at what point was there community engagement during the design and planning process of the rail trail? And they couldn't answer that question. And they kind of were saying, oh, well, it's a bit of a straight line. And I mean, I don't really know, it was just pretty easy to design. So it made me question, oh, yeah, you're right. Maybe it is a straight line and maybe we don't need to ask people what they think. But then people were kind of notified about it. That's what I found out. There were newsletters that went around. People in the community, active cyclists, heard about it once it was opened. It wasn't as if there was an active engagement with people, even residents in Rangeview or people at each end, business owners maybe. Then you've got this product and there's just so many things, even children. I mean, I'm surprised there were no workshops at all the school. There's 3 schools along that.
There are 4 schools on it within a very short space to it. There's also the TAFE on the other side, people coming from Caboolture station, who the kids coming home from schools from other places. Tons of patients who come from the hospital who use the WAM.
Workers,
A whole lot of people. And it's one straight line, and that one straight line causes a huge amount of problems. There's no shade.
Yes.
There's no slowing down traffic coming. It would have been really amazing if you had been able to put some kids' spaces on that.
One thing that I found just ridiculous was one of the schools situated along the rail trail. As I said before, a lot of landowners encroach upon these old rail corridors because they've just been out of use for so long. And one of the schools encroached along it so much they fenced where the path was going to go. So obviously council approached them and yep, it's fine, and they put the rail trail down anyway. I think to appease the school, they popped some car parks out the front of the rail trail. So
I know which school you're referring to.
If you're from the area, you would know, but I don't know what the decision was making.
It was a trade-off.
It was a trade-off, exactly. They already have a pretty large car park inside, so it's council giving space to parking, which in this environment is sometimes just necessary because there's no other options. But what else could have that been? That could have been a beautiful seating area. It could have had more planting. Who knows? It doesn't really have to be much, and there isn't much thought going into it, but it's much easier just to pop in a few car parks. So things like that I'd love to see, and I know community members would love to see, and I haven't interviewed any children, but through friends and friends' children, they've mentioned to me there's no bins or shading or bubblers. I think the first bubbler is a while down towards Wamuran. So really just obvious small improvements, and these things can really go a long way, especially when you're cycling in the Queensland summer.
So cycling is one thing, but I know people who buy their groceries in the main shopping centre in Caboolture, and then they walk, and they're seniors, and they're walking, it's boiling hot, there's no shade, there are no benches, there are no bubblers, as you say, there's no place to rest, there's nothing interesting along there. Yesterday I was telling you that a lady that I was speaking with, she took her 2 grandchildren, one was 7, 11, and these guys come along on those scooters, teenage boys, and they come along in packs, and they're like, "Meow," and push the daughter off the WAM. And when I spoke with people, they said, yeah, it's a real issue.
And it's just such a shame because it connects The working title of my thesis is The Power of the Pedal Connecting Communities. It's just such a joy to be on when you're on it. There's always improvements when it comes to space, and societies change, and it's never a fixed state. We constantly need to be creative, new people moving in, other people moving out, people are leaving. It's just such a connector. It's heartwarming when people do say hello, and it'd be a shame if the council didn't put in even more small adjustments to foster that.
It might cost a couple of grand to make it good. You can get lots of things to do. It takes time. You have to engage with the community. That takes time. That takes resources.
Yeah, and all for free if it's coming from an advocate that's doing it on a volunteer basis.
Yeah.
This is again where I come back as a planner, and as an employed planner, you should be activating communities and have a presence as council. And I'm driving down the roads at the moment, there's the elections, there's so many posters going up about candidates, and it just feels so detached from the actual people that are implementing the ideas. And they're very approachable councillors. They've been great to talk to, but at the same time, they're not the ones working in the team. And if there was a bigger presence of the council planners, the people in the sustainability team, the landscape architects, all those sorts of people.
It's very hermetically sealed.
Yes.
I can write letters, but I get no. They're polite. At least it's not that horrible stuff. You know, when you write a letter to an organisation and they write back something incoherent and illogical, and you're sitting there going, why are you even bothering writing this stuff? Either you don't understand it, or you think I'm stupid and I won't understand it, or you think that it's acceptable practice to write something which is completely low grade, poor quality. That just says something about the person writing it, that they think it is acceptable to write a poor quality document.
And at the end of the day, you're doing them a huge favour. It's not like you're stirring up politically. You're just making obvious observations of really, really small things that need improving. Like, who can argue against a better footpath? It's not like you're trying to get rid of all cars and people will need to drive at some point in their life. And
the point isn't to make it car free. The reason I call it Get Around Cabo car free is not to make the place car free. It's so that people can get around car free.
And not to support alcohol consumption, but sometimes when I was in Germany and having a drink or two and being able just to walk home, it was a joy, you know. And there's all those other safety issues around driving as well.
Social isolation is a big byproduct of living in a car dependent society, because huge tracts of the community are socially isolated, and that increases gambling addiction, substance abuse, and alcohol drinking. That costs the community, and those people who could contribute to the community can't, simply because it's too hard to get out.
Yes, and I even think about the ageing society that we're in, and Caboolture, I sometimes see it as the Florida of Australia. You know, it's warm, it's comfortable to live in, people are really happy, and there is that big senior population up on King Street, that big retirement.
There's lots of retirement.
There's so many
places
on King Street.
I think in Australia, 1 in 3 people is over 75, and we're the most urbanised society in the world. I do notice there is a lot of money being spent on public transport and active transport where people have money.
Yes.
And where people actually need to have the infrastructure. They need the public transport because they're low income. There's no infrastructure, there's no spend.
Yep. And even access to green spaces as well. You know, that whole environmental justice movement about if you're poor, you don't have not only access to good public transport or to essential services, but green space. Like, how important is it just to be able to walk in a shady area, you know, especially if you're elderly or you have health issues and you're affected by the heat.
Even something simple. So the bus stops are actually really far apart here. They're really far apart in Queensland. The train stops are really far apart here. It's really difficult. And then if you want to walk from the bus stop or to the bus stop, and it's 30 degrees, and there's no shade, there's no benches, there's no bubblers, and you've got this horrible big road in front of you in order to get from this side to that side, and you've got to go cross at 3 traffic lights in order to cross the road, which sounds ridiculous, except that's actually what you've got to do a lot of the time. That's what it's like in a poor community. Anyway, this is your program.
You're explaining it more coherently than I would anyways. No, these are the things that are upsetting, and I think Caboolture could do better. I think Wamuran can do better. Woodford, I don't know if you've been out to Woodford yet.
I have never been to Woodford because it's too hard to get there.
Because it's
It's just like, why would I bother? And they have Woodfordia, which is a big festival, and $20 for the bus service each way, I think.
I was talking to one of the councillors, and there is a plan to connect the rail trail up to Woodford, and I don't know what the status is with that. But then in a perfect world, getting the rail trail up to Kilcoy to reinstate that old railway corridor and then even connect it up to the Brisbane Valley Rail Trail. I don't know if that would ever get through.
I wanted to ask, could the Wamuran Rail Trail go from Caboolture up to Kilcoy? Is there technically a capacity for that?
I think there is. So one of the local councillors is currently, I think, working towards getting it linked up to Woodford. However, there are some issues around land ownership and some, I don't know, maybe higher gradients, I think, or some landowners that don't necessarily want to give that space away. So they've kind of diverted it around and linked next to the Diagular Highway and then linking it back up to the rail trails. I haven't mapped out exactly where that route would go, but I think there is a plan to go up to Woodford. I don't know why people feel so offended if they see some cyclists or runners going past their property. I don't know if it's that. I don't know if people just feel like their privacy is at stake.
I did read something, they put in a rail trail somewhere and all the local residents and the farmers were going, no, you can't do that. And then they put it in and it's like, oh gee, it's really lovely, isn't it? And this is what we hear again and again and again. Everyone's really against it. You do it, you trial it, and then everyone goes, oh gee, this is really great. We should just keep going with that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Build it and they'll come.
The thing that I have learnt is that the WAM is great, but the reason why the usage is not as high as it could be is it's not connected to another space, which is easy and lovely to be on. Because you meet Beerburrum Road at one end, which is completely horrible. Once you get to the end of the WAM, well, you get to the end of the WAM.
Well, you do. You get to the end of the WAM, and the funniest thing is, so many people park over at the co-op. There's like a farming equipment store that you can go to, and just out the front they have, I don't know if they're designated for the rail trail, so not sure if you're meant to park there, but everyone does because they can take their bike out and go on up and down for a bike. And just to get to that car park, I mean, it crosses a road and it's obviously there's no crossing or anything, but there's a curb and it hasn't been cut. So even if you wanted to bike over it to get to your car, it's just very uncomfortable. Super simple things like that would just make it really easy. And I mean, I think there's been adaptive urbanism examples of people cutting curbs. There was a podcast that I listened to, 99% Invisible, and they talked about people going and literally, because the council wouldn't do anything, I think this was somewhere in the US, literally destroying certain curbs at corners or at traffic lights because people in their wheelchairs, prams, bike riders, anyone with wheels couldn't comfortably get down. So you're exactly right. You get to the end of the WAM Rail Trail and there's a lovely coffee shop next to the IGA that people often go to. There's no easy way of crossing that busy Diagular Highway. You have to kind of go left 50 metres, then go to a refuge island, then go across, then cross another road next to the IGA and then go to the coffee shop. Whereas if you're in your car, you can just drive comfortably up and literally park.
Yeah. And I meet people actually on the WAM and they say, gee, it'd be great to be able to go from the sunny coast down to Northern Rivers in New South Wales. So this is something that I hear often. And they're going, wow, this is really hard work. I'm like, yeah, welcome to Caboolture. Yeah. It's hard slog.
The funniest thing is that people always comment on the fact that the population density is missing. We don't have enough users. There's no people. It doesn't justify the cost of implementing this rail trail or even reinstating the rail. But I always think that Australia used to have a functioning rail network before the car was the main form of transport. So it worked back then.
When you listen to Charles Morone, he says, in my town of Brainerd in Minnesota, it's 13,500 people. They had this amazing tram work that went everywhere. They undid it all and now it's all car dependent. And do you know how big his town is? 13,500. Yeah. So it hasn't changed. It's just more horrible and people just travel further.
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to come up to the end there because we've run out of time. Anything you would like to add? You're doing your master's thesis. If you would like that master's thesis, that's due to come out in...
It should be complete by the end of May.
Just contact us at getaroundcabocarfree.com.au and we will forward on that request, no problems. Anything else you would like to say? A wish from the council or the TMR or the community?
Don't give up. Cycling or walking or mobility scootering or e-biking, they are all forms of mobility that should be taken seriously and they shouldn't be put in competition with the private vehicle. Public transport should be improved, better buses in Caboolture, all the things that you're saying in your wonderful page, Wendy.
You know, the way I put it is there is just every opportunity here. Yes. There's nothing you can lose basically because there's nothing to lose.
And it's a beautiful region. I love coming back home and I love being around such good fresh fruit. When you do drive, you drive past so many farms and so much fresh produce imagine doing that on your bike, but then actually being able to stop, have a drink of water and eat a fresh mango. And you'd be supporting people like my parents, other farmers, and those we rely on the agricultural industry of this area, and it's all got to be planned holistically. And
it'd be great. You could do a farm trail, actually.
Farm trail, historical trail. There's so many options, and rail trails, I think, are the future.
All right. Well, I will call it that. So at the time of recording, we are in February 2024. It's been a lovely conversation. Thank you so much.
Wendy.
Thanks for enjoying Streets and People, presented by Get Around Cabo Car Free. We publish our podcast regularly at the usual places and on our website, where you can find out more about us. getaroundcabocarfree.com.au. That's www.getaround, get around, that's pretty straightforward. Cabo, C-A-B-O, that's short for Caboolture. Car Free, C-A-R-F-R-E-E. There's no hyphen in that. .com.au. Our theme music is The Thief on AM Sound, which is just like our cars on our streets, always stealing the space. So let's stop that thief.